Robin Hood men in tights emerged from the casual mockery of an 11-year-old boy in a sterile dental clinic. Mel Brooks once engineered a plan to prop a fever-stricken, delirious actor against a wooden board just to capture 2 lines of dialogue. And the chilling truth remains, not a single lead actor in Sherwood Forest actually sang a note. If this film seems familiar, only half of the illusion has been perceived. Leave a comment detailing how many of the upcoming 21 facts were known before the curtain is finally pulled back. 1. The 11-year-old mastermind in the dental clinic. Beverly Hills, that particular summer. The scene unfolds inside Dr. Evan Chandler's dental clinic. The monotonous hum of the air conditioner fills the room. Jordy, the doctor's 11-year-old son, had just glued his eyes to the screen, finishing Costner's cinematic hit. Unlike peers dreaming of jungle adventures, Jordy saw only sheer absurdity. Sitting on the waiting room sofa, he meticulously picked apart the ridiculous logical voids the way the protagonist grimaced with a mismatched accent and dropped a cold, detached verdict to his father: this production completely deserved to be mocked. Evan Chandler did not let that passing joke fade. The dentist saw an unmined goldmine. Days later, leaning far back in the dental chair, a familiar patient opened his mouth for an examination. It was screenwriter J. David Shapiro. Amidst the piercing shriek of the drill and the glaring surgical light, an unspoken Hollywood pact was forged. The father repeated the exact mockery of his 11-year-old child. The screenwriter listened. The skeletal framework of Men in Tights officially took shape right inside that room, heavy with the scent of medical alcohol. The cinematic machinery began to turn. The cameras rolled. Mel Brooks commandeered the director's chair. The film premiered, hauling in endless laughter and millions of dollars in revenue. The halo of the spotlight beamed directly onto massive names. But rewind that VHS tape to the final seconds. Stop at the credits scrolling upward against the black void. Scan for the name Jordy. Nothing will be found. The 11-year-old boy lost the credit for his own inception. Yet, he was not the only one to experience a sudden jolt of disorientation within this project. When the initial casting calls echoed from the production office, suspicion immediately knocked on the doors of the chosen. Los Angeles, an early 90s afternoon, the shrill ring of a landline shatters the silence. Cary Elwes lifts the receiver. On the other end, a rapid-fire voice, carrying the trademark raspy cadence of New York comedy, echoes through. The man claims to be Mel Brooks. 2. The rookie's hung-up phone call. Without a second of hesitation, Elwes slammed the phone down. A prolonged dial tone filled the void. The actor was convinced it was a prank engineered by a friend. His skepticism had a solid foundation. In the grinding gears of the film industry, contracts are negotiated through endless layers of representation. A legend possessing a catalog of classics rarely dials an actor's private residence himself. It wasn't until the bell rang a second time. This time, the irritable tone from the other end confirmed reality. Brooks was forced to convince the stubborn man on the line that he was, in fact, director Mel Brooks. Brooks's selection contained a calculated motive. He did not discover Elwes through a randomized audition 6 years prior. In The Princess Bride, 1987, Elwes had constructed his character's demeanor directly upon the mannerisms of Errol Flynn, the legendary 1938 Robin Hood. Brooks had silently monitored that transformation. He required exactly that cinematic material for his new endeavor. Every inherited gesture, every swing of the blade from Elwes was what Brooks intended to place dead center in the frame. Elwes agreed. Audiences saw him on the silver screen, smiling and assured. But not everything in Sherwood Forest was as it appeared. Torches flicker amid the artificial nocturnal woods. Cary Elwes and Amy Yazbek draw close. The theater audience drowns in seamlessly smooth vocal performances. Lips sync flawlessly to every breath. Glances are exchanged, heavy with intention. The 90s audience bought into that phantom. They walked out of the multiplex, hunted down the soundtrack cassettes, shoved them into the tape decks of their Ford Tauruses, and hummed along the highways. 3. The fabricated auditory contract. Inside a freezing, soundproofed recording studio in another corner of Los Angeles. The truth diverges. The lip-syncing on set was merely a visual charade. Not a single main cast member lent their vocal cords. The velvet tones echoing from the theater speakers belonged to Arthur Rubin and Debbie James. They were studio professionals. They pushed the high notes, controlled the vibrato, and transmitted raw emotion through an acoustic pop filter. Meanwhile, on location, Eloise and Yazbek merely memorized the rhythm and matched their mouths to the beat. The individuals actually generating the sound stood immobilized in the shadows. They pushed their vocals through the isolating glass, surrendering all the spotlight to the bankable faces on the posters. Audiences consumed a flawless sonic phantom for 3 decades. Not a single soul among them knew the difference. Yet, not everyone required an auditory stunt double. Someone stepped into Sherwood Forest carrying something entirely absent from the props manifesto. The camera pans across ancient trees forged from plywood and plaster within the soundstage. A 19-year-old black man steps into the frame, lanky, awkward in a skin-tight green ensemble. Surrounding him are the battle-hardened veterans of American comedy. 4. The debut beneath the green canopy. Audiences in 1993 looked at the massive screen and saw only an obscure supporting actor trying to keep pace with Brooks' high-speed machinery. He played Achu, a name articulated to mimic a sneeze, a few fragmented, sarcastic lines, a few exaggerated physical expressions. Everything captured on celluloid appeared to be nothing more than a fading background role, engineered to consume space around the main cast. Before selling out colossal stand-up arenas, before creating television broadcasts that permanently altered how America processed pop culture, Dave Chappelle touched cinematic ground with this exact role, an unknown rookie, carrying raw street energy, standing amidst a claustrophobic medieval set. That decaying VHS tape on the shelf harbors the Genesis footage of a future titan in stand-up comedy. That absurd costume was the first brick laid in a media empire. A young, uncredited actor could easily be swallowed whole by the overwhelming scale of a massive project. Achu was not, and the reason lies in the item he independently brought from his home to the soundstage. 5. The sneakers that wandered off-set. Kids growing up in the 90s, especially boys who spent hours shooting hoops on blistering asphalt, knew that sound by heart. In 1993, the Reebok pump was not merely foot protection. It was a status symbol. It was the era's most brilliant street culture, where kids believed that just by pressing the tongue a few times, air would flood around their ankles and turn them into giants capable of leaping over any obstacle. Return to the set during the sequence where Achu prepares to charge into hand-to-hand combat. The camera cuts to a tight close-up of Dave Chappelle's feet. The 19-year-old rookie bends down, using his thumb to repeatedly press the inflation valve on the tongue of a blindingly white Reebok pump, an artifact carrying the pure DNA of 1993 sitting brazenly in the mud of medieval England. Hollywood's wardrobe department operates as a machine with millimeter precision. Specialists obsessively distress every fold of a cloak, sanding down leather boots so they appear to have endured decades of sun and rain. That protocol applies to everyone. But when Dave Chappelle walked from the parking lot onto the set, he kept his street-style sneakers on. No leather boots, no burlap, only bright white industrial leather and the logo of a modern sports conglomerate. Mel Brooks sat behind the monitor. A standard director would have screamed, demanded a cut, and summoned the wardrobe team to force a pair of suede boots onto the actor immediately. But Brooks was an old fox of satire. Brooks witnessed that contrast on the monitor and didn't bother calling the wardrobe crew. He twisted an obvious continuity error into a secret handshake with the youth. When the VHS tape hit this scene, Gen X kids sitting in front of CRT televisions instantly recognized the cultural barcode of their generation, a modern shoe trampling the logic of the historical setting. Establishing a singular rule here: there are no rules. Chappelle didn't just bring sneakers to the set. He drove the 90s street straight into the core of Hollywood. The comfort of a rookie in sneakers stood in stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere in another corner of production. When the lens shifted to more powerful figures, laughter was extracted at a severe biological cost. The Los Angeles heat strangled the air inside the soundstage. Beneath high-wattage lights blasting from the ceiling, the temperature constantly pushed the limits of human endurance. And amidst those suffocating costumes, one man's immune system was collapsing. 6. Prince John's medical scene. Richard Lewis was never a comedian of robust physical endurance. His hollowed face, sunken eyes, and perpetual state of nervous tension were his certified trademarks on the stand-up stage. As Prince John, Lewis had to drape himself in heavy capes, remain in constant motion, and juggle lightning-fast pacing with the director. During the final days of filming, half the set stood empty. Richard Lewis had vanished. In a sterile hospital room miles from the studio, a heart monitor beeped with a cold, steady rhythm. The scent of antiseptic pierced the air. Lewis lay motionless on the bed. The thermometer pointed directly at 41 degrees Celsius, 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Hepatitis A was ravaging his liver. His body was so depleted that simply opening his eyes demanded extreme concentration. On the other side of the city, the gears of a multi-million-dollar film possessed no pause button. Equipment rental schedules counted down by the hour. Production costs incinerated the budget every second a camera stood still. Mel Brooks stood in the middle of the set, staring at a completely hollow shooting schedule for Lewis's scenes. He picked up the landline receiver and dialed straight to the hospital room. The conversation was rapid, leaving zero room for excess empathy. Rumors from the technical crew present that day have echoed through the decades. Brooks did not call to check on his health. He called to lock down the shot. The veteran director's plan carried the absolute coldness of the film industry. An ambulance would be dispatched to the hospital, load Lewis onto a stretcher, and transport him directly to the set. There, the design team would erect a wooden plank. Lewis would be strapped or leaned against that board to prevent his fever-stricken body from collapsing to the floor. "I know you're sick," Brooks's voice echoed through the speaker, "but you can come out here, read exactly 2 lines, and go home." There was no CGI to digitally replace human presence, only a physical vessel and a frame that demanded to be filled. Brooks' demand pushed the boundaries of biological endurance to the absolute edge. Lewis lay on the hospital bed, soaked in sweat, and rejected the proposition. Survival instinct overpowered the iron discipline of the studio. When audiences rewind the tape and laugh at Prince John's grimacing, distorted expressions, they remain unaware that a fraction of that contortion does not stem from acting methodology. It comes from a man battling a fever ravaging his organs, pinned between physical agony and the ruthless pressure of a machine that never learns how to stop. But not everyone faced Hollywood from a position of weakness. Some individuals walked into this project holding absolute power, and they utilized it to issue demands that left even the most hardened production executives speechless. 2 years before the snap of Mel Brooks's clapperboard yelled, "Action!" the global box office was rattled by a sequence lasting mere seconds at the conclusion of Prince of Thieves. As Robin Hood's wedding unfolds, a figure parts the crowd and steps forward. Sean Connery, King Richard. No billing on the poster, no participation in the promotional circuit. The appearance of the former 007 agent delivered absolute gravity to the film's entire climax. Gen X audiences remember that exact moment in the dark. A murmur of astonishment swelled from the shadowy rows of seats the second Sean Connery spoke. Mel Brooks understood the currency of that moment perfectly. Satirizing a film while ignoring its ultimate wildcard is an unforgivable omission. The Men in Tights script reserved a regal void for King Richard in the closing act. 7. The former king's cross-dressing demand. Faxes were dispatched from Brooks' office to Sean Connery's representatives. The production unit desired a historical repeat, Connery returning as King Richard, but this time in a parody mocking his own imposing shadow. The Scottish actor received the script. He signaled his agreement. But stars occupying Connery's echelon do not operate by standard protocols. They forge their own rules of engagement at the negotiation table. The counter-demand from Connery's camp dropped onto the producers' desks like an explosive. First, he would not wear knight's armor or a marble-studded cape. Connery wanted King Richard to appear in drag, a bulky dress, a wig, garish makeup, the most angular, masculine icon of British cinema. The man who had taken down countless villains in the Bond franchise wanted to personally shatter his own image with a feminine gown right in the middle of Sherwood Forest. Second, the price tag for that subversion was exactly $1 million. That entire sum had to be wired directly into the accounts of charitable organizations in Scotland. The concept of a cross-dressing King Richard reeked of the absurd humor perfectly aligned with the DNA of a Mel Brooks picture. The director fully understood that sequence would dominate the headlines of every publication. Yet, the reality of financial figures was significantly colder. Men in Tights was a comedy operating on a tightly calculated budget. $1 million for a few minutes of screen time from a guest star was a cut too deep into the ledger. Phone calls dragged on, compromises were floated and promptly discarded. In the end, the studio's calculators defeated artistic audacity. The production team shook their heads. The contract collapsed. The image of Sean Connery in a dress was permanently buried in the drawers holding Hollywood's unfinished drafts. Patrick Stewart was summoned to fill the void. Audiences lost the chance to witness the most psychotic deconstruction of an icon in the 90s. Sean Connery's refusal was anchored in money and defiance. But another 90s legend turned his back on Sherwood Forest due to a career pivot that later mutated into one of the most baffling anomalies in pop culture. The roar of stadiums packed with tens of thousands of people, glaring red and yellow bandanas, the sound of rough fabric torn apart by bare hands. In the early 90s, Hulk Hogan was not just a wrestler, he was an ideology for American youth. Hulkamania swept across every cable channel on Sunday mornings, turning the giant with the trademark mustache into an entity transcending the ropes of a squared circle. When casting commenced for Men in Tights, the script required a behemoth to guard the tiny wooden bridge spanning the creek. The character, Little John. Physical requirements, muscular, massive, possessing overwhelming force. Hulk Hogan was the first name inked onto the casting room's whiteboard. 8. The Ring legend's rejection. Files and scripts were dispatched. The collision of Hogan's physical presence and Mel Brooks's satirical mind was projected to generate a massive detonation at the box office. Male audiences who grew up clutching WWFF VHS tapes would not bypass the opportunity to watch their idol wielding a wooden staff, trading blows with Cary Elwes. But Hogan declined. The offer was returned to the production office. Hollywood is a terrain built on corridor whispers, and Hogan's refusal was rapidly smothered by endless fabrication. The actual reason behind that rejection has never been officially confirmed. The role of Little John ultimately fell to Eric Allen Kramer, and nobody at the studio ever uttered the massive wrestler's name again. The personnel shuffling was saturated with last-minute pivots. But once the cast was locked in position, the cameras rolled, and right from the very first line of dialogue, Mel Brooks took direct aim at Kevin Costner. In the summer of 1991, cinemas worldwide were dominated by a melancholic atmosphere. Kevin Costner delivered a brooding, tormented, agonizing Robin Hood. Yet there was one detail that caused the most cynical viewers, especially the Gen X demographic armed with razor-sharp critical thinking, to raise an eyebrow. The voice? A legendary knight of ancient England projecting a thick American accent straight out of California, occasionally laced with hollow British inflections before sliding right back to the original tone. Nobody inside the studio that year dared to vocalize this friction. The audience knew, the critics knew, but Hollywood opted to look the other way. 2 years later, Mel Brooks decided to rip the bandages off that awkwardness. 9. The dialogue that dethroned the predecessor. The camera settles on a medium shot. Cary Elwes stands in Sherwood Forest, staring straight into the lens, breaking the fourth wall, devoid of any protective layers. He flashes a half smile and articulates every word with a crisp, flawless English accent. Unlike some other Robin Hoods, I can speak with an English accent. Audiences in 1993 theaters erupted in satisfying roars. That was not merely a comedic line, it was psychological release. Gen X constantly craved authenticity and harbored a deep disdain for clumsy media cover-ups. When Cary Elwes spoke, he operated as the proxy for millions of people who sat in the dark 2 years prior, forced to ignore linguistic failure just to consume a film. Brooks did not draft lengthy analytical essays on acting methodology. He deployed 10 words to entirely strip away the majestic facade of the predecessor. This strike aimed straight for the throat, precise and impossible to defend against. The destructive radius of this dialogue was so immense that it manufactured a pleasant headache for international distributors. When the film was exported and dubbed into other languages across Europe or Asia, the joke regarding a proper English accent lost its original context. Local translation units were compelled to invent entirely new phrasing to maintain the objective of mocking Kevin Costner, all while matching their native tongue. A single sentence on a Los Angeles set triggered a synchronized wave of ridicule on a global scale. But Brooks did not stop at audio. Having locked onto the target, he weaponized visuals to turn another heavyweight rival into an absolute joke. And this time, he resurrected a technique from his own past. Inside the mobile makeup trailer, technicians carefully adhered a small, black piece of rubber onto Richard Lewis's sunken face. Day 1 of shooting, it sat squarely on his left cheek. Day 2, it migrated to his right cheekbone. By midweek, that black mark slid down to his chin. 10. The mockery named the mobile mole. Alan Rickman had crafted a classic Sheriff of Nottingham in the 1991 iteration. Audiences remembered Rickman for his ruthless demeanor, cold cadence, and a distinct mole resting on his face. Mel Brooks isolated that minuscule physical detail and decided to magnify it to the absolute peak of absurdity. Throughout Men in Tights, the mole on Prince John's face refuses to stay still. Within the exact same sequence, merely from a camera angle shift, the mole's position migrates. It dances across Lewis's face like a conscious entity. Brooks provides zero explanation for this mutation. Casual viewers might easily miss this anomaly, but for loyalists, the Easter egg hunters always hovering over the pause button on their VHS decks. This was a visual reward. Gen X took pride in their capacity to catalog every micro detail of pop culture. Upon detecting the dancing mole, they felt they had been granted access to a closed-door game with the director. In reality, this was a recycled asset. In 1974, within the masterpiece, Young Frankenstein, Brooks had applied this exact mechanism to Marty Feldman's Igor. The hump on Igor's back constantly shifted from right to left, paired with the legendary line, "What hump?" 2 decades later, That mechanic was reborn on the face of Richard Lewis by salvaging old material. The director broadcasted a clear signal to mock the massive stature of a rival. He only needed to deploy a cheap gag from 20 years ago. Occasionally, the greatest moments do not emerge from the makeup trailer, but from raw muscle and pure physical execution. The archery tournament, pine bleachers ablaze with banners. Every Robin Hood film demands this sequence. It is an obligatory ritual. In 1938, Errol Flynn split the arrow. In 1991, Kevin Costner executed the shot with a camera bolted directly to the shaft of the arrow, engineering a slow-motion effect that deceived the eye. Hollywood always knew how to leverage special effects and editing tricks to turn amateur actors into flawless marksmen. But when Cary Elwes stepped up to the firing line, the camera allowed no deceptive angles. 11. The real-life bullseye. The harsh California sun beat down on the range. Elwes lifted the longbow, muscles tensed. 6 years earlier, in The Princess Bride, 1987, Elwes had dedicated months to grueling training so he could personally perform the classic sword fight ambidextrously. He carried that iron discipline from fencing straight into archery, an actor stepping into a satirical comedy, yet offering up a physical skill at the highest possible tier. In 1993, computer graphics were beginning to overhaul the entire industry. Mel Brooks chose to keep the camera running. Cary Elwes executed that shot himself, with a number of takes that could be counted on one hand. No CGI, no obscure angles hiding the reality. The arrow tore through the wind and pinned itself dead center in the bullseye. The camera kept rolling. Honed physical precision yields exact footage, but a filmmaking machine truly detonates when it embraces the anomalies that exist outside the printed pages of the script. Darkness consumed the witch latrine's chamber. Bubbling potions, hazy cold smoke. Tracy Ullman, a comedic anomaly, stood amidst that ghostly atmosphere. The script dictated this was a transition sequence. Sheriff Rottingham would infiltrate from above. Everything had been marked with tape on the floorboards. But when the actors began to interact, the paper script became meaningless. 12. The unscripted freefall. The deafening crack of splintering wood echoed. Sheriff Rottingham, played by Roger Rees, pierced through the ceiling, falling freely and landing with a thud right in the middle of Latrine's bed. A cloud of wood dust plumed into the air. That event simply did not exist in the script. Brooks maintained absolute silence. The camera kept rolling. He knew he was operating with two masters of physical performance and handed them the autonomy to shape the chaos. Tracy Ullman's reaction was pure instinct. She lunged forward, projecting an expression of supreme regret as Rottingham barely managed to roll away, and delivered a line straight from her subconscious. "I was this close. I touched it." That dialogue is entirely absent from any original script draft. Brooks preserved that flawed take flawlessly for the final cut. Yet, not everything in Sherwood Forest was driven by coincidence. Buried beneath the layers of the narrative are details hidden with such cold calculation that, 3 decades later, nobody has truly questioned why they exist there. 13. Patrick Stewart's identity loop. The heavy oak doors swing wide, light spills onto a chiseled face and an iconic bald head. Patrick Stewart. To the general public, this was merely a flawless contingency plan after negotiations with Connery shattered. But to the millions of Gen X males who locked their eyes on cable television every night, this moment carried a much heavier, more cynical gravity. In 1991, during the Copied D episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, Stewart's own Captain Picard was forced by an alien entity into a simulated world, compelled to wear a green tunic, wield a bow, and masquerade as Robin Hood. Mel Brooks held a firm grip on this pop culture fragment by casting Stewart as King Richard. He was dragging him back into Sherwood Forest once more. From a man forced to play Robin Hood on a space station, Stewart now walked boldly onto the silver screen to act as the king of a different Robin Hood. Brooks offered no explanations. He knew exactly what his demographic was watching on Tuesday nights. That memory linkage did not stop at casting. It infiltrated the smallest props on the set. 14. The barcode on the chastity belt. Brooks pushes the camera extremely close to Maid Marian's chastity belt, zooming in on a tiny detail dead center. Under the torchlight, a word reveals itself with undeniable clarity: Everlast. To boys growing up in America during the 80s and 90s. Everlast was no ordinary vocabulary word. It was the sour stench of sweat in a boxing gym. It was the logo stamped on the gloves of Muhammad Ali, of Mike Tyson, of countless nameless fighters pounding their fists into heavy bags. The director took that specific label and welded it straight onto the medieval device guarding a woman's purity. Not a single word of explanation. It merely sat there, prominent and irrational. When the film hit, VHS male Gen X viewers hammered the pause button on their box televisions just to confirm their eyes hadn't malfunctioned. And if a chastity belt can sport the logo of prize fighters, then the weaponry of outlaws can certainly be packaged using the methodology of suburban housewives. 15. The plastic egg of the industry. The battle preparation sequence. Muscular men line up, eyes sharp, audiences brace themselves for swords, arrows, and chainmail. Instead, they produce plastic eggs. They snap the pale gray shells in half, pull out sheer green pantyhose, and slide them onto their hairy legs. The combat ritual mutates into a women's locker room routine. Legs was not merely a hosiery brand. It was a campaign that altered the shopping behavior of an entire nation, shoving fragile pantyhose into a plastic egg, placing them on a rotating rack by the register of discount supermarkets. Any kid who ever trailed behind their mother buying groceries remembers that exact image, as familiar as a cereal box or a bottle of ketchup. Brooks hooked directly into the childhood memories of millions. A symbolic feminine item shoved into the hands of forest outlaws gearing up for a raid. Nobody in the production office thought this was a bad idea. 16. The Braille Adult Magazine. Shadows pool in the castle corner. Blinken, the blind servant, sits on the toilet with a thick magazine. As the lens creeps closer, the rabbit head logo materializes on the cover. Playboy? To Gen X boys, it was the forbidden artifact hidden beneath older brothers' beds. Its singular value was visual. So what was a man born blind doing with it? Blinken's fingers glide over dense rows of raised dots. He is reading the Braille edition of Playboy. Brooks thoroughly understood the boundaries of the Motion Picture Association. One frame of genuine nudity would secure an R rating instantly, severing the entire revenue stream from the younger demographic. He needed a dirty joke, but the frame had to remain absolutely clean. Not a single centimeter of flesh appears on screen. Brooks borrows the dark imagination of the viewer to complete the punchline, casually bypassing the censors without sacrificing a single frame. Braille pages and plastic eggs were just the surface. As the footage draws toward its close, the director begins tampering with the most fundamental theorems of reality, starting by scavenging his own remnants in the recording booth. 17. The recycled melody. Theater audiences in 1993 savored the track Men in Tights, backed by a grand male choir. A driving rhythm, catchy lyrics, soundtrack cassettes sold out rapidly. That melody sounded perfectly tailored for a band of medieval outlaws singing deep in the woods. But to the loyalists of Mel Brooks, this composition carried a chillingly familiar sensation. They dug through their old media collections, rewound the finale of 1981's History of the World Part 1, and found a teaser titled Jews in Space. It was the exact same piece of music. Brooks spent absolutely nothing to commission a new arrangement. He ransacked his personal archives, extracted a forgotten background track, rewrote the lyrics, and pasted it over his multi-million-dollar project. He plagiarized himself, simultaneously turning it into an Easter egg reserved strictly for those with the memory capacity to recognize it. He constructed an entire fortress of satire using scrap materials from his past. And when the music has been recycled, the laws of physics have no reason to remain intact. 18. The Mediterranean butterfly stroke. Unroll a world map across the table. Measure the distance from the coast of Jerusalem, across the Mediterranean Sea, along the Atlantic coast, and ending in England. Thousands of nautical miles. Even the most seasoned fleets of the Middle Ages required months to traverse it. In 1991, Kevin Costner brought Robin Hood back to England with an infamous geographical glitch, washing ashore at the White Cliffs of Dover, and then walking to Nottingham just before nightfall. Instead of correcting that geographic sin, Mel Brooks decided to magnify it to an inexcusable extreme. Early in Men in Tights, Cary Elwes drags his soaked body onto the beach, clothes drenched, hair plastered, gasping for air. When asked how he returned from Jerusalem, the character delivers a clipped response: he swam. No rafts, no vessels, only two arms paddling across thousands of miles of ocean. Logic is the enemy of laughter. Brooks required no explanation, and an audience raised on Looney Tunes where characters can sprint on thin air does not require an explanation. 19. The two-decade obsession. 1975, 18 years before Men in Tights hit theaters, Mel Brooks brought his cynical mindset to national television with a sitcom mocking the Robin Hood mythos when things were rotten. The initial episodes aired amid massive anticipation, but 70s television audiences were not prepared for Brooks' frantic, satirical pacing. Ratings plummeted. By the time the series reached its 13th episode, a cold cancellation notice was handed down. The project was immediately shelved, sets dismantled, cast dispersed. When things were rotten, sank into the shadows of television history. But Brooks is not the type to accept defeat at the hands of his own subject matter. The obsession with Men in Tights prowling Sherwood Forest smoldered for 18 years. When the Costner iteration triggered a global fever in 1991, Brooks saw an opening. Men in Tights was not merely a product chasing a trend, it was a cold case file being pried back open. That obsession did not halt at the script. It dragged the entire production crew to a highly specific coordinate on the California map, a place where the phantoms of Errol Flynn were still standing, waiting. 20. The waters-preserving phantoms. Not far from central Los Angeles, concealed among the arid hills of California, lies Lake Sherwood. The scenery is so tranquil that no one would suspect it to be one of the most iconic plots of land in Hollywood's cinematic history. In 1921, Douglas Fairbanks chose this exact surface to embody Robin Hood. 17 years later, Errol Flynn donned a green cape, swinging his sword through these very canopies to craft the classic The Adventures of Robin Hood. In 1993, Mel Brooks hauled a fleet of equipment trucks, props, and dozens of comedians to trample upon that precise patch of dirt. When Cary Elwes performed his absurd sequences by the lake, he stood in the exact coordinates where Errol Flynn once executed the most legendary shots in film history. The sound of inflating Reebok pumps, sarcastic lines of dialogue, and clumsy falls echoed amidst the ghosts of previous generations. That is the art of deconstruction on a physical level. You shatter the image of a hero directly on the soil where it was born. Yet, the heaviest punishment Mel Brooks reserved for his characters was not anchored in geography, nor in physical pratfalls, but within an administrative decree that permanently altered the vocabulary of billions. 21. The punishment named after the privy. The camera pushes in on King Richard. No grandiose declarations. The king simply delivers a brief verdict, renaming all the toilets in the kingdom to John's. A sentence executed through vocabulary. Brooks uses the final seconds of the film to explain the origin of the slang term John, the ubiquitous noun in modern American English, denoting a restroom, by binding the name of the treacherous prince to the chamber of bodily relief. He engineered a joke that spilled out beyond the screen. Centuries later, whenever someone asks for the restroom, they are forced to invoke the name of the man who harbored ambitions of usurping the throne. Royal power was dragged down to the absolute bottom of daily existence. In the realm of satire, physical strength is not required to destroy an icon. You merely need to attach their name to a toilet bowl. Outro. The dry mechanical screech echoes. The CRT television screen flickers with a few lines of static before sinking into an endless abyss of blue. The VHS tape is shoved back into its frayed cardboard sleeve, placed back on the shelf. Robin Hood. Men in Tights rests securely in the memory of a generation. The anachronistic Reebok shoes, the Braille magazines, and the sarcastic dialogue became the shared dialect of those raised in the magnetic tape era. One detail remains officially unconfirmed: did Mel Brooks genuinely, deliberately select Lake Sherwood as a direct challenge to Errol Flynn's legacy? Or was it merely the decision of production executives glancing at spreadsheets and picking the closest location to slash costs? Not a single crew member ever gave a straight answer to that question. They abandoned the set and took their silence with them. The lake remains perfectly still. Across these 21 behind-the-scenes shadows just revealed, how many details were already known before this tape was rewound? And if this VHS was once owned in 1993, which moment demanded the pause button the most? Leave those numbers and memories in the darkness below. Every response will be examined. Until the next tape is loaded,